The overcrowding at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary will not be relieved by a new federal prison in Louisiana. That prison is being built to handle new deportees. Officials say tonight the so-called bad ones will still be sent to Atlanta.
Tonight, the status of those so-called bad Cuban prisoners, 1,800 of them, remains unresolved, mired in lawsuits and red tape. In his special assignment, Bob Serkin examines the plight of the Cuban prisoners and the roots of their frustration.
Sunup at the Big A. Wake-up time at this troubled ancient house of granite and iron. The Atlanta Penitentiary, one of America's oldest, most overcrowded, and violent prisons.
The tension is very high, because I don't know how I can explain it, but feel high, for sure.
Atlanta Penitentiary inmate Barbaro Dominguez is among 125,000 so-called Marielitos, Cuban refugees who in the spring of 1980 fled Fidel Castro, coming ashore in South Florida, seeking a new life of freedom and prosperity. Instead, the seasick and confused Marielitos were hustled off to processing camps in different parts of the country for long months of waiting and interrogation. Eventually, the majority of the Cubans, still without any official status, were released to sponsors. But since 1980, more than 4,400 of them had been pulled into the Atlanta Penitentiary for crimes ranging from simple failure to follow immigration procedures to murder. Today, 1,863 Cubans remain locked up, most without formal convictions, all without release dates. Their frustration has given way to violence. At least 9 Cuban prisoners have been murdered here, 3 since last October, including the strangulation on Sunday of 31-year-old Oscar Bermudez Dominguez. In February, 28-year-old Lazaro Calero Ramos was stabbed to death after a guard led him handcuffed into a shower room.
Just by implication, one would think that the guard certainly should have been capable of acting before the victim, who had his hands cuffed behind his back, was stabbed 10 times.
In the midst of the stabbing, the guard reportedly ran for help.
The level of tension and frustration among Cuban inmates here is so high that more than half of all inmate attacks throughout the entire federal penitentiary system are occurring inside this prison.
Warden Jack Hanbury would not permit us to take new pictures inside the cell blocks. Hanbury defends his institution against widespread charges of fraud, mismanagement, inmate mistreatment, and uncontrollable violence.
We are in control of this institution. We always have been, and I can go to sleep tonight confident that that's the case.
If it's under control, then why can't we get our camera in?
Simply because I feel that the camera is so disruptive to the inmate population that it would cause us more problems than I am willing right now to have.
Hanbury, who promises to take us on a prison tour without cameras, has denied us access to prison records detailing assaults and murders. Channel 2 News has petitioned the Federal Bureau of Prisons under the Freedom of Information Act to gain access to those records. Father Joe Fay has been banned from the prison and from administering to the Cubans. He's charged with smuggling out letters and criticizing the government's treatment of the Cubans in a series of newspaper articles. Father Fay says it's violence that breeds violence.
We should see the violence that is imposed upon them from outside. Violence can be in the structures that destines these men to live in this type of a situation. The violence of not allowing hearings, the violence of not granting those who have already committed finished their sentences the opportunity to be free. That is a violence too.
We've heard more about violence and alleged substandard living conditions from these Cuban inmates who agreed to talk to us despite fear of retribution from prison officials. 39-year-old Armando Maya Betancourt, convicted of cocaine possession in 1981, was sent to the Atlanta Pen 2 years ago after an alleged probation violation.
The immigration don't have right to stay me here for indefinite time, and give me a chance, give me back to my family, or give me a boat and I go to I don't know where,
32-year-old Maximo Martinez Ferrer is another convicted drug user still considered unfit for society by the government.
I have never in my life seen anything like this. At times I find myself sick and I need to go to a doctor. I sign up on a list, and it may be 1 or 2 weeks before I can see a doctor. We feel very bad here because they have not treated us as equals.
Please tell kids to stay away from my damn door.
There is plenty of despair outside prison walls where families of Cuban inmates wait in less than ideal conditions. Maximo Martinez's wife and 3 children live in this cramped, roach-infested Southwest Atlanta apartment. They exist on welfare and handouts from friends, living as Martinez does, day to day.
Maybe one day somebody's going to be banging on my door telling my husband killed somebody or somebody killed him. What am I going to do then?
What is life like for you and the children?
It's hard. You see the place I have to live in. I've never lived in a place like this in my life. The children, my oldest daughter, all she does know, when is my papa going to come home?
Under current U.S. immigration law, an illegal alien caught within U.S. boundaries has more rights than the Cubans who were invited in.
3 times during the past 2 years, federal Judge Marvin Shub has issued orders granting certain rights to the Cuban prisoners. The right to legal representation, the right to a hearing to determine the prisoner's releasability. 3 times, Judge Shub has been reversed by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The government arguing the Cuban prisoners are in effect non-persons who technically aren't even in this country and have no rights at all. Meanwhile, frustration and tension keeps building inside the Atlanta penitentiary, parts of which remain in a lockdown. In the prison cemetery, they've already buried 15 Cuban inmates, victims of murder and suicide. Now they keep a freshly dug grave ready for whatever may happen next. More federal court hearings on the disposition of the Cuban prisoners will be held in Atlanta in 2 weeks. We should also point out that since 1980, the U.S. government has deported at least 250 Cubans back to Cuba. But Fidel Castro stopped accepting them last spring when the U.S. turned on powerful Radio Marti, broadcasting anti-Castro propaganda. Quite a dilemma, John and Monica.
Very interesting story, Bob. Thank you.
More rumblings tonight from inside the troubled Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. This time, it's from the guards, demanding immediate relief from what they call increasingly dangerous and intolerable working conditions.
The prison guards charge that their bosses are guilty of ignoring unsafe practices and in trying to manage more than 1,800 Cubans angered and frustrated over their open-ended sentences. Here's Bob Serkin with another special assignment look at the Cuban dilemma.
2 things make the Atlanta Penitentiary a unique prison: its almost exclusive Cuban population and its reputation as the most violent prison in America. Since the Cubans arrived 6 years ago, the Atlanta pen's badly overcrowded cell blocks have been ravaged by 9 murders, 7 suicides, 400 attempted suicides, 2,000 self-mutilations, 700 inmate-on-inmate attacks, and more than 150 serious attacks on prison guards. The most recent last Saturday night, when an enraged Cuban prisoner sent 2 guards to the hospital with head injuries. Bobby Harnage is an executive officer of the Prison Workers Union.
It can't go on much longer. You're going to have the employment problem is going to get even worse. When you have a better than 60% turnover in manpower, you know, that's astronomical. The prisoners do not fear any retaliation. That's obvious.
Extra guards have been brought in from other federal prisons to help control the Cubans, but the 280-member Guard Corps remains understaffed and underexperienced. The guards and their union are demanding action. More manpower, better training, including Spanish study, more swift government prosecution of inmate attackers, and more security protection equipment, radios and body alarms, which automatically call for help when a guard is attacked.
They claimed there wasn't enough money for that, but then we found out here in the last few days there was enough money for VCRs, for obviously management's own entertainment, but there wasn't enough money to make the correctional officers more secure.
And I categorically deny that that has happened. Every budgetary item in this institution is controlled through unit decisions. I do not arbitrarily or automatically move funds from one decision unit to another.
Hanbury claims he hasn't been presented with any list of demands. The Prison Workers Union also accuses Hanbury of trying to intimidate staff members. In this letter, Hanbury warns the president of the Prison Workers Union against writing members of Congress about prison conditions. Reportedly, guards have also been threatened with dismissal for talking with reporters.
They were not concerned for the officers because, like, I was cut, and they never would take me out of that environment. And
Kenneth Maddox is an ex-prison guard who is talking about his 3-year stint inside the Atlanta Penn's notoriously violent segregation unit. Maddox left his job last April following repeated attacks, stabbings, and a nervous breakdown. Maddox claims prison officials delayed his workman's compensation payments when he could no longer perform his job.
I was threatened, like to being stabbed on a number of occasions, constantly. Urine and feces stolen on me constantly. When a new officer generally come into the SEG unit, they make it an appointment to start a fight. Somebody in that unit is going to have a fight with that officer.
Are all those Cuban prisoners as bad and dangerous as prison officials tell us they are?
I wouldn't say that all of them are. There are some that would be really good citizens.
Earlier today, Warden Hanbury allowed us to tour the prison without our camera, claiming it would be too disruptive. We found parts of the prison plenty disruptive, despite the absence of our camera. Our prearranged tour took us through 3 of the prison's 5 cell blocks.
It should be noted that portions of the prison were cleaned, even repainted for our tour. One cell block housing mentally ill Cuban prisoners was near empty. Our escort told us the inmates were taken away to watch a movie. As expected, most of the areas we visited were overcrowded, noisy, and in some cases disruptive, especially so in the segregated unit where most of the 9 murders have occurred. The tension level is extraordinary. You can see it in the guards' eyes. Cuban inmates banging and shouting wildly, "Libertad, liberty." Monica and Ray, we were denied permission to walk through that segregated unit.
Might be better that you weren't.
Thank you, Bob, for this continuing reports on the Atlanta Federal Pen.
We'll be hearing a lot more about it.
Okay, thank you.
The United States Justice Department and the Public Health Service have closed an Atlanta halfway house, which is one of only 15 in the nation dedicated to rehabilitating Cuban prisoners. This halfway house in southwest Atlanta has fallen victim to the Graham-Rudman budget cuts.
The closing is seen as a setback for those trying to win rights and freedom for Cuban prisoners. Tonight in another of his special assignment reports, Bob Serkin introduces us to one ex-Cuban prisoner who's made good.
26-year-old Pedro Gonzalez, happy, working, and free.
Sometimes not a lot of pain. Sometimes look like when everybody thinking they're gonna get out, like that. Sometimes we hear in the prison, everybody got to come back to Cuba.
Pedro Gonzalez has been on his new job as a DeKalb County sanitation worker only 6 months. He earns $5.50 an hour, about $4.80 more than he was paid for menial labor inside the Atlanta Penitentiary, where he spent a year. His alleged crime, arguing with an immigration official. Gonzalez transitioned into American life through this Atlanta halfway house, now closed due to budget cuts. The halfway house, run for 2.5 years by Atlanta University and funded by the government, cost a mere $350,000 a year to operate. But its success was huge. Out of the 18 Cuban prisoners graduated from here, 7, including Pedro Gonzalez, remain crime-free. 15 more Cubans were scheduled to be treated here. Not only did the halfway house produce a happy, productive, law-abiding prospective citizen, but it filled a job few persons were willing to take on. Billy Mosley is Pedro Gonzalez's boss.
He's conscious about getting his work. He's up here always on time. Most of the time he's in here around 7 o'clock waiting on to go to work. He's what you call a little extra, good worker.
Gonzalez, whose prison ordeal caused him several psychological problems, comes home each night to his American-born wife, Carol. The Gonzalezes are expecting their first child next month. Gonzalez sees himself as a former unwanted Cuban who's more than proven his worth.
For letting no immigration, we can do a lot of things in this country. Sometimes I think America's a good place for life, but sometimes I don't understand the system in here too. Because we come in here because the president this time, they come in here.
Do you think your Cuban brothers still locked up in the penitentiary could do what you've done?
A lot of Cuban brother can do the same thing I do.
Carol Gonzalez says helping her husband transition from prisoner to provider was no easy task. For one thing, immigration officials disapproved of their marriage.
I spent my time trying to find him a good job, something that he can feel like he was a man of the house, that he was doing something for his family, and somebody to care for him, because basically all he really needed was to feel loved and have security. So,
Mrs. Gonzalez, do you worry that they're going to come and take your husband away again?
if he gets in trouble again, I'm quite sure they'll be knocking at my door, because we've had those threats. I've had them personally.
Gonzalez is only one of 130 out of 1,860 Cuban prisoners who have been released into society. Paul Kish is a U.S. public defender who represents Cubans. Kish says the government really isn't committed to rehabilitating Cuban prisoners.
Based on the government's past 5 years of conduct regarding these men, they are not one bit interested in rehabilitating any one of these people to have them live as citizens or aliens in the United States of America. The only thing they're interested in doing with these guys is using them as a political pawn in a big chess game with Castro.
On Monday, the Cuban prisoner dilemma returns to the courtroom. In Atlanta, the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals will hear arguments from the government trying to block an order by federal Judge Hsu. He wants to grant hearings to most of the Cuban prisoners to determine their releasability. The government still contends that most of the Cubans locked up are too dangerous to set free. Monica and Terry, I don't think I've ever covered a more emotional and volatile story than this one.
You can certainly see it in that report, too. Thank you very much, Bob.
Fearing a summer of even more violence inside the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and other jails, the U.S. government is trying to convince Fidel Castro to take back 2,700 Cuban prisoners who came here during the 1980 Mariel boat lift.
A broken agreement between Castro and the United States and a controversial radio station are blocking the Cubans' exodus from here. And another of his special assignment reports on the Cuban dilemma. Here's Bob Serkin tonight from Washington.
La prensa opina. The sound of Radio Marti, despised by Fidel Castro, cherished by several million Cubans seeking truth and objectivity.
Radio Marti le ha hecho más difícil a Castro acomodar sus...
Only 11 months old, operated by the Voice of America, broadcasting 17.5 hours a day from Washington, Radio Marti is getting through. Its 50,000-watt transmitters in southern Florida beam a wide variety of news, editorials, and entertainment to Cuba. Since going on the air, Radio Marti has told the Cuban people about their government's attempted kidnapping of a Cuban defector in Madrid last December, about the sinking of a Cuban tourist boat and deaths of 39 aboard by Cuban military officers overreacting to the hijacking of the ship by 2 teenagers, and about the Cuban government doubling its broadcasting budget to counter Radio Marti's growing popularity and influence.
When the U.S. turned on this powerful radio station last May, it, as expected, reignited Fidel Castro's furor. To retaliate, Castro reneged on his 1984 agreement with the U.S. to take back the majority of 2,700 so-called Cuban misfits dumped here during the Mariel boat lift.
Only 201 Cuban prisoners were returned under the agreement. In exchange, the State Department allowed Cubans to obtain visas in Havana for travel to the U.S.
Radio Marti is not negotiable.
Ken Skog, State Department Director of Cuban Affairs, helped negotiate the deal Castro broke.
We are not going to buy that agreement a second time by paying a higher price. The Cubans knew very well at the time the Mariel agreement was negotiated between June and December of 1984 that we intended to put Radio Marti on the air.
But Congressman Robert Kastemeyer, whose House Judiciary Subcommittee is investigating Cuban prisoner conditions, says Radio Marti is expendable.
I think we did blow it. Radio Marti is not that much in our interest. After all, the Cubans do listen to South Florida commercial radio stations in Spanish language and like them. but they don't need to be propagandized by yet another radio station, which costs us $11 million a year.
So controversial is the Cuban problem and Radio Marti that earlier this month the New York Times editorialized that for the sake of democracy and well-being of the Cuban prisoners, Radio Marti should be turned off. Then, 10 days later, the Times, saying it had second thoughts, praised Radio Marti's accomplishments. Dr. Ernesto Betancourt, Radio Marti's director, says the price of pulling the plug is steep.
We have expanded substantially the amount of information accessible to the Cuban population. We have forced the Cuban government to significantly change its overall radio and TV programming.
Due to increasing violence inside the Atlanta Penitentiary, resolving the Cuban prisoner dilemma is receiving high priority here. However, no direct U.S.-Cuban talks are planned for the near future. The U.S. does have one other option it may soon decide to exercise to try and force Cuba to start talking again. That is, imposing more economic and political sanctions against the Cuban government. Bob Serkin, Channel 2 Action News at the State Department.
But our top story tonight, 55 of the most dangerous Cuban prisoners Castro did not want are now inside the already overcrowded and tense Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Good evening. I'm Monica Kaufman.
And I'm John McKnight. Terry is off tonight. The Cubans arrived just a short time ago under heavy security. They were sent here after causing a violent disturbance at a Miami immigration detention center. Channel 2's Bob Serkin reports from the federal pen.
The 55 Cuban prisoners, so-called Marielitos, arrived from Miami by bus. The Cubans, heavily shackled, tired, and emotional. The 760-mile trip made with more trouble. This morning in Lake City, Florida, the Cuban prisoners caused another disturbance, shouting and rocking their bus, trying to break out of their restraints. The Florida Highway Patrol assisting in removing the Cubans from the bus, searching them, and reboarding them for the remainder of the trip. The transfer of the Cubans due to yesterday's disturbance at Miami's Chrome Avenue Detention Center, housing aliens awaiting deportation. 150 Cuban detainees hurling rocks at guards, setting a dormitory on fire. A disturbance sparked by some detainees stealing clothing from others. Immigration officials call the troublemakers hardcore criminals.
Normally, you deport aliens from every other nation in the world. But again, as I say, they can't be sent back to Cuba.
260 other detainees have been shipped to a new federal holding facility in Oakdale, Louisiana.
The arrival here of the 55 new Cuban prisoners does not come at a good time. At a time when the prison's badly overcrowded population was just beginning to shrink a bit.
A population which has recently dropped from 1,865 Cuban prisoners to 1,800. A setback for the efforts of prison officials to ease the overcrowding and tension.
Well, by sheer numbers, it'll create a problem for us in taking that additional time to decrease the population and do whatever we plan to do by that additional 55 who are coming in. And I seriously doubt that they will cause us, as a group, any specific problems any more or any less than anybody else.
Lawyers for the Cuban inmates call the latest influx of prisoners a setback to their efforts to win the Cubans better conditions and basic rights.
Assuming that any progress can be made in this regard, if every time there is something that happens, that the population in Atlanta is increased because of some crisis, whether anything really will be done.
Tonight, the 55 new Cuban prisoners join 109 others being held in a tightly guarded, segregated cell block, a place in which 7 Cuban inmates have been murdered during recent years.
Right now, the 55 Cuban detainees who just arrived are being screened by prison officials. They'll be given medical checkups, fed, and then placed in that solitary, segregated cell block where so much trouble has occurred over the past few years. By the way, 600 of the 1,800 Cuban inmates already imprisoned here are still under lockdown conditions, not allowed to leave their cells only at certain times during the day. This issue and the placement of these 55 Cubans here today refocuses attention on the conditions under which these Cuban inmates are being held and the fact that under U.S. law, they have virtually no basic rights. Terry and Monica?
Thank you very much for that report, Bob Serkin, from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary.
Well, the infamous Atlanta Penitentiary is once again the target of a federal investigation. This time, as Channel 2's Bob Serkin reports, the Justice Department is looking into claims of payoffs to prison and immigration officials.
There are claims Cuban and American inmates have bought their way out of the prison to halfway houses and minimum security camps.
They are among the lucky ones. 11 Cuban inmates being transferred earlier this month from the hell of the Atlanta Penitentiary to the relative comforts of a Kansas City halfway house and eventual release. These Cuban inmates among 220 who have been transferred to halfway houses since last October, most qualifying for the privilege by being nonviolent, convicted of only misdemeanors. But Channel 2 News has learned that the Justice Department is investigating the transfers of some 40 hardcore convicted Cuban felons, inmates who, according to sources in the Justice Department and the U.S. Immigration Service, have bought their way out of the Atlanta Penitentiary.
He told me about if I paid some money, almost $10,000, I can't get out of here. Go to the halfway house, next thing go home.
Did you do it?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't want to go out this way.
Jose Barrano is a Cuban still being held in the Atlanta pen. Barrano says he's told the FBI that his former cellmate paid $10,000 for transfer to this Kansas City halfway house. Barrano has supplied the government with this letter. Barrano's former cellmate reassuring him, writing, "Remember that when everything looks difficult for liberty, there is a way, and you can get in contact with me." Barrano says he's also told the FBI of other Cuban inmates, felons buying their way into this halfway house in Detroit and this one in Chicago. A Justice Department official says among those under investigation is Robert Joseph Wright, a former immigration officer in the Atlanta pen, now a U.S. Customs agent in Florida, being investigated for allegedly arranging and selling paroles or transfers. According to our sources, the Cuban transfer deals were made inside this prison hospital from August of 1985 through January of this year, a time when over 200 Cuban inmates were hospitalized and force-fed for going on a hunger strike. His name is Felix Diaz Herrera, imprisoned since 1984 on a domestic misdemeanor conviction, fighting with his wife. Diaz Herrera claims he's witnessed payoffs for parole. Diaz Herrera has provided information of alleged illegal transfers to federal judge Marvin Shube, the FBI, Atlanta's U.S. Attorney Steve Cowan, and to Channel 2 News.
I know about the matter to immigration, transfer, release people here with big felons. Big felonies? Big felonies, in drug case, robbery, in other case, making kickbacks. Kickbacks. You know why? The misdemeanor case no go out because no got the money for pay nothing.
This is beyond just being treated unfairly, that it's despicable conduct on the part of certain people who are profiteering on the basis of human misery.
Gary Leshaw, an Atlanta legal aid lawyer, represents Cuban detainees in their class action suit against the government on prison conditions.
There have been, over the last couple of years, a series of middlemen who have contacted the detainees, the families of the detainees, let certain detainees know that for a price, usually $10,000, they can receive transfer to a halfway house from which they will ultimately be released.
A Justice Department official tells us this man is also under investigation. He's Louis Richard, Atlanta District Director of the U.S. Immigration Service. Investigators want to know if Richard knows anything about the claims of illegal transfers and transfers being made in exchange for money.
Have you ever approved a transfer of a Cuban inmate from the Atlanta Penitentiary to a halfway house who paid for that transfer?
No, sir. I would not knowingly have done any such thing. And I will not go into this any further. Mr. Serkin, the interview is over if you insist on pursuing this line of questioning.
The government's investigation also involves claims from inmates of paid illegal transfers of some 20 American prisoners, transfers from the Atlanta pen to less restrictive minimum security camps. Inmate Garrison Winstead has supplied Philadelphia federal judge Anthony Sirica with this list of Americans who have allegedly bought their way out of the Atlanta penitentiary. Winstead claims he was once denied a legal transfer.
I was denied because I didn't meet the criteria as to, I wouldn't say the criteria, I wouldn't meet the standard of paying $5,000 for a transfer.
Also under investigation, according to Justice Department sources, Jack Hanbury. Since retiring this summer as prison warden, Hanbury has worked as a prison consultant to the U.S. Immigration Service. As warden of the Atlanta pen, Hanbury reviewed and helped process inmate transfers. Joseph Petrosky, the newly appointed warden of the Atlanta Penitentiary, has declined comment on this report. So has the Federal Bureau of Prisons. It's our understanding that a federal grand jury will soon begin hearing evidence in the prison pay for transfer case. And just a few hours ago, Atlanta's U.S. Attorney Steve Cowan issued this statement to Channel 2 News. Cowan saying the FBI is investigating certain allegations of improper releases of Cuban detainees from the Atlanta Penitentiary. However, says Cowan, such an investigation is incomplete and it would be inappropriate to make further comment. Cowan still refuses to comment on the alleged American payoffs for transfers from the Atlanta Penitentiary. Terry and Monica?
Very interesting story. Thank you very much, Bob.
Growing federal concern tonight over the two major investigations in the credibility of two government agencies. One, the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. The other, the Atlanta District Office of U.S. Immigration. The district INS director is under investigation for alleged fraud. As Bob Serkin tells us, that investigation is expected to result in the transfer of the INS top man here.
Louis Richard, Atlanta District Director of the INS. Richard, under Justice Department investigation for allegedly approving the illegal sale of transfers from the Atlanta Penitentiary. More than 40 Cuban detainees allegedly paying as much as $10,000 each to transfer to halfway houses, such as this one in Kansas City. Allegations made to Channel 2 News, the FBI, and to federal judge Marvin Shube in these sworn affidavits. Allegations Louis Richard steadfastly denies.
I would not knowingly have done any such thing, and I will not go into this any further. Mr. Serkin, the interview is over.
In another major federal investigation, Richard and his office are being questioned about the alleged illegal approval of visas to foreign nationals fraudulently married to Americans. Government sources say plans are being made to transfer Richard to another office while the investigations continue. Richard and the INS decline comment. Newly appointed U.S. Attorney for Atlanta, Bob Barr, says those investigations threaten to damage the INS's credibility.
It's our view that whenever allegations are raised about federal employees, federal officials, or federal facilities, that they can, if they are not resolved one way or another, start to erode the credibility of those federal agencies, and that's not something that we like to see.
Barr and other government officials are equally concerned over the credibility of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons and its management of the trouble-ridden Atlanta Penitentiary. Past and present prison officials under investigation for allegedly selling more than 20 American inmates transfers to low-security prison camps. The Justice Department says among those it is investigating is former Atlanta Warden Jack Hanbury and his lawyer Herb Schaefer. In sworn statements to the Justice Department, inmates Lawrence Baker and William Jennings allege that Schaefer helped arrange and sell illegal transfers approved by Hanbury. Jennings alleging that Schaefer offered him a $10,000 transfer deal to a Florida prison camp. Baker alleging that Schaefer told him he represented Hanbury and the prison staff. But Herb Schaefer denies he's ever arranged an illegal transfer or kickback fees to Jack Hanbury in exchange for his influence.
I defy you, I challenge you to publish anywhere in the world the slightest inference that I have ever committed the crime of paying Jack Hanbury one farthing. Now, are you listening to me, sir?
Jack Hanbury has been unavailable for comment on this case, refusing to return our calls.
It is a very important matter. It has a high priority, as would any similar type of case involving federal officials and federal facilities.
The government's investigation into the alleged sale of paroles and transfers from the Atlanta Penitentiary is now in its 7th month. But according to a Justice Department source, the time is drawing nearer to when the government will present its findings before a grand jury here. Bob Serkin, Channel 2 Action News at the U.S. Courthouse, Atlanta.